So let's do the official opening of this ceremony today. And it will be in English. Dus welkom iedereen. Zoals ik het daar juist aan een paar mensen heb gezegd, was het onze bedoeling om vandaag in de droomgaard te zitten. Maar kijk, corona en het leven zijn langsgekomen en we hebben ons een klein beetje aangepast aan de situatie. Het is een droomgaard virtueel online. So, we are here because of Michel Bauwens. We all want to listen to him. But the aim of this meeting is actually to dare to imagine. Imagine written with an E of energy and emergence, and also linking that to imagination. We are here a whole bunch of people, a tribe in Antwerp, who try to help the transition towards a most beautiful future our hearts know is possible. And we do it by organizing all kinds of events about imagination, about art. We are organizing ULAB sessions and prototyping weekends. We are coming together for all kinds of rituals, trying to respect nature. And one of the things we do is this kind of sessions, dare to imagine. So you have your imagination, and then you have the daring part. And so each time we invite somebody who in some way dare to do something or to live differently. And today this person is Michel Bauwens. Hello, Michel, and thank you to be here with us. Could you please introduce yourself and just tell us what you think is the most important thing or most relevant for us to know right now? For me, you're the father of the P2P, but that's maybe just a shortcut. You're so much more. So please introduce yourself.
Well, just as a person first. So I'm 62. As you know, every decennia in your life goes faster and faster for some reason. I have 4 children, 2 in France and 2 in Thailand. So I live in northern Thailand, Chiang Mai, which is quite an interesting place to live. It's the capital of digital nomads, apart from many Thai people, of course, but this is really quite a high-tech place actually in the world where many programmers and designers come to live. You know, all those people who can work from their computer, basically a lot of them come here. So we have 25,000 people on a Facebook group called Digital Nomads Chiang Mai. And just for the anecdote, because I like this anecdote, I went to one of the meetings about 18 months ago, and at the time we had 4 blockchain meetings a week here, which is, I'm sure it's more than in Antwerp. And so this one person was saying the problem in Chiang Mai is that we can't find anybody who wants to work for money anymore. Just to tell you that this is a thriving economy where people in this kind of blockchain ecosystem, because of the bitcoins and all that stuff, they actually managed to to accumulate enough wealth to actually do their passionate engagements. We agree or we don't agree what they do, but it's a very interesting phenomenon because a lot of people here are engaged in all kinds of projects because they can. So I basically have a nomadic life myself to a certain degree. I usually try to work in the West. So the last 3 years that was with Smart, which is based in Brussels, the labor mutual for autonomous workers. And I do a lot of speaking, lecturing, workshops. Every summer I try to write a report. And my last report was maybe a bit boring for you people, but for me very exciting. It's called P2P Accounting for Planetary Survival, because I believe that basically accounting is how we see the world. And so if we don't see things in the accounting, then all the corporations and states and businesses do not take into account of those realities because they can't see them. That's one of the projects I was working on. And right now I have quite an ambitious project, which is to update the book by Karl Polanyi, who wrote a classic book called The Great Transformation, which is a really great book. It's a history of capitalism from the late 17th to 1945. And so I've come to a kind of conclusion in my work at this stage, which I'd like to share briefly. So the kind of notion that we have a real pulsation in human history between extractive polarity and a generative polarity. And so if you look at human history, and this is not based on just my wishes, but because I've looked at various historical schools that are collating evidence of this. So basically, every competitive system will overuse its resources, not as an exception, but as a rule. And this means that every class society, every civilization always comes to an end through ecological crisis. And that will then stimulate regenerative responses. And here's where my work comes in. What humanity usually chooses to do in those moments is to regenerate the commons. And so just to define it for those who are not familiar with the idea of the commons, it's the human institution like the market and the state and the gift economy and the household, if you like. But specifically, it's about sharing resources. So you have a shared resource, a community of people or a coalition of stakeholders that want to collectively manage that resource and that do it in an autonomous way. So that's very important because it means it's not a state and it's not a market, it's something that is independent. And what's so important about the commons is that it's the only human institution in history which has been capable of maintaining resource levels in a stable way. So if you look at the mountain flanks in Austria and Switzerland and you wonder why are they so green, it's because they're commons, and it's the village communities that have been doing this for hundreds of years, since probably the 12th century. They can document the agreements, the commons agreements that instituted these particular commons. And so right now we have a revival of the commons because we have a huge extractive crisis. The difference is, of course, it used to be regional or continental, a whole empire. And now it's the whole world. So there's no escaping it. And this has a particular consequence, which is that we cannot just continue the wave, right? The wave, which was extraction, regeneration. We are at a stage in human history where we actually have to transcend the wave. We have to be able to create what some people call a steady state economy. And so I'm working around these topics. And maybe one more thing I want to introduce for those people who don't know what it means, peer-to-peer. So my view is that we are switching from a system that is dominated by competitive entities, the competition between nation states and the competition between corporations, to open collaborative systems where people and collectives and corporations can come in and out. And so we see this already in the open source economy that function that way. We also see the emerging blockchain communities working this way. But also if you look locally, you would see urban commons. So I did this project in Ghent in 2017. And we looked at the number of urban commons in 2006. There were 50. And there were 500 in 2016. So in 10 years' time, there was how do you say that in English? Decoupling? No, that's not it. 10 times. 10 times more urban commons than 10 years before. And this is a general phenomenon. And the next step, so if I can give you a brief history. So first, the commons were natural resources. That was privatized by capitalism. Then the commons became social risk systems. So basically, all the things that the labor movement created to manage social risk, because they were unprotected. So they created all these welfare systems to protect themselves, and that became, the welfare state. So that was statified, if you like. Then we have the open source revolution. So basically a huge increase in knowledge collaboration. And what we're doing is an example of this. You're right, everybody's free to come here, and we kind of build a common knowledge through what we learn from each other outside of any corporate or state form of organization. And so the next step, this is what I'm working on right now, is called cosmo-local production. And it has a very simple rule. Everything that's light is global and shared, and everything that's heavy is local to the extent possible. And why is this so important? So first of all, we spend 3 times as much on transporting things and on making them. So if you look at what we call thermodynamic usage, so how much matter energy we use from nature, so we use 3 times as much just for transporting stuff, right? And this means that neoliberal globalization is not sustainable. So we have to go back to a system with much, much more relocalized production. On the other hand, though, I don't think we want to go into a xenophobic, closed, competitive nationalism either. So we have to remain culturally united, be able to collaborate in the whole world, basically. And of course, because a lot of issues today are global issues, they're not local issues. We cannot solve them only locally. But I want to give you an example of permaculture. So if you do permaculture, you are very, very local. It is basically a patch of land close to where you live. At the same time, you'll be connected with all the people doing permaculture in the whole world and learning from each other, and doing the global perma-design certification and collaborating in all kinds of websites that build collective intelligence around permaculture. So this, you can see, this is cosmo-local, right? It has both a local and a cosmological logic at the same time. This is new. This is something that we couldn't easily do before. And so here's what I propose, and because I still have very much a structural way of thinking about the world. I'm not denying consciousness, we can talk about it later. But I think structures are very important because they determine, where we are in the social system and the degree of freedom and the degree of resources we have access to. And so now we have a market-centric capitalist society, and the state serves the market. And civil society doesn't really exist as a core. It's something peripheral. You vote every 4 years, and it's what you do when you come home tired from work, mostly, right? So civil society is not seen as a core. Now, what I propose is to look at society as a contributive system. So the value is not extracting commodities and labor and making profit. The value is who is contributing. And everybody's contributing. There's not a single person in the world that is not contributing in some way to something that benefits other people. So every citizen is a contributor, and this is where the value is created. So if you work in a collective intelligence system like an open source project, it's open. You can contribute or not, that's your choice. And once you come in, your value is determined by your contribution. So are you a good programmer or not a good programmer, a good designer, not a good designer? Are you, a good facilitator like Xenia, or a bad facilitator? So things become, the logic of value becomes a contributory value. This is where value is created in our society. And this is very interesting because once you have that conception, then care is a contribution, right? Care is not a commodity. We are not commodifying the work of a mother or a father with a child, or children caring for their elderly parents. We are not commodifying this in our system. Once you see the world as a contributory system, this is These people are contributing value. So imagine that citizens contributing to commons become the core of a civilization. Then the next step you would think about is, well, okay, you know, for some things we might need markets, and there's a lot of discussion about markets, but I would really urge you to see markets as different from capitalism, right? Capitalism is a kind of market, which is where profit is the main driving force. We can have many other kinds of markets, and I call these generative markets. Generative markets are markets that work for the community and for the natural beings and natural resources. So how would a commons community that creates value together, how would they design their interaction with the market, eventually creating their own market entities, co-ops, solidarity economy, social entrepreneurship, you know, whatever is available as legal form to organize. But you see immediately it's a different relationship between civil society and the market. And then the next step would be, well, what do we do with the state? And I would do the same with the state. I would say, what kind of public authority, what kind of common good institutions do we need to make the whole system work? And this is what I call a partner state or a community state. And it's a state that enables and empowers individuals and collectives to be, you know, to be creative and to find solutions. I can stop here for the moment and see if you have questions, or Xenia have more questions. But this is kind of the general thrust of what I'm doing. And so what I do is I look at seed forms, right? So you have a stable system, a complex, stable, adaptive system. And at some moment in time, it becomes to disintegrate. The stable system becomes unstable. So then you have this chaotic transition. This is where we are in now. So first we had 2008. That's where the instability started, very much becoming very serious. But they managed to spend a lot of money to, you know, to kind of arrange some of the effects. COVID is a new shock to the system. It's a revealer and an accelerator of the contradictions of the destabilizing system. And so what happens now is that people try things out which by its very logic have to be different than the stable system which it is integrating, right? So the people who find solutions that are different from the logic of the old system. So you have to look at all these seed forms. How are people solving their issues? What is working, what is not working? And so my thesis is that actually what people are doing is confirming what I'm saying, is that people are actually now reviving commons in order to solve their issues, creating new types of markets around it, and trying to find new ways of managing and governing these projects. I want to give you maybe one example to make it visible. So in Brussels, you have the micro factory, which is a very interesting place. And okay, here's the micro factory is part of the multi-factory system. There are 120 of them in Europe. So these are places where craftspeople come together who work with matter. So steel, fashion, textile, 3D printing, plastics, anything to do with, you know, working with materials. And they look for old factories, you know, and take them over, and then they organize as a cooperative, and they follow open source principles. So these people are creating this ecosystem throughout Europe with 120 different places, and they're all working together at what they call the invisible factory. This is it, right? So they have these different communities that are local, and then they cosmify their knowledge in the invisible factory. And this is happening in a lot of domains, and I can look at spirituality, business, you know, and you will see these new forms emerging, and they all seem to have something to do with the common. And mutualizing, right? Mutualizing our provisioning systems is going to be key to bring down the human footprint. So the more we do this, the less chaos we will have, right? We can maintain complex systems by inventing new ways of sharing increasingly scarce resources. Either we fight for them and we have winners and losers, or we decide, can we find ways to mutualize them in equitable and ecologically sustainable ways, so we still have transport, we still have good housing, we still have good education and medicine, but at a much lower thermodynamic human footprint than before. So this is for me one of the challenges of change that I'm working on.
Xenia, can I, because I'm following the group chat a bit, and there is a question for
yes, I'm not reading, so sorry, because I'm talking.
No, it's okay. So that's why I'm going to take that role. So I'm going to follow the chat. So if you have questions, please add it in the chat. When we were talking about cosmological production, there is a question of Eve. Is scientific research also an example of cosmological production? Perhaps that is what makes it successful. So scientific research.
Well, to the degree that it works like that, yes. But in the 70s, there were all kinds of legislations. I forgot the name, but it started in the US. And you would be surprised, but a lot of science is no longer working like that. It's, scientific research is patented, put under copyright restrictions. You have scientific articles which are very expensive and are bankrupting libraries. So yes, science, as it used to be, and as it should work in this way as a commons, a public commons for the whole society in the world. Think about the discussions now around the vaccines, right? Where Sanofi just said 2 days ago that they would start with a vaccine in the United States because they pay, right? This is not a public good. This is why millions of people continue to die from AIDS, because the poor in Africa could not pay the medicines, which cost $20 to produce in the factory, but were sold at $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 because of the patents, right? So this is the answer. So we have the commons, and we have enclosures. Enclosures privatize the commons and turn it into a capitalist market. And that, unfortunately, has happened with a lot of science in the last few decades.
Okay, thank you. There is another question. So you spoke about cosmological production, contributory society, and community state. Marike wonders if that all together isn't the perfect society structure for an unconditional basic income for everyone.
Yes, I personally like the idea of the basic income, because there's a lot of people that want to transition, that have a new value system. They want to eat organic food. Maybe they want to go farming and have sheep, want to start social entrepreneurship, want to do a lot of things, but they are a prisoner of the present system, right? They are dependent on their mortgage, their wages. They can afford to buy land because land is too expensive for organic farmers. So there's all these issues that, even though a majority of the people in our society say they're sympathetic to sustainable transition, they're hardly doing it in practice. And I think the basic income for me is one of the key ways in which we can allow a lot more people to do transitional work. It gives you kind of a basic safety, which allows you to take more risk when you're changing your lifestyle. And I personally think this is very important, because if you don't have anything, this is very dangerous also for your psychology. I experienced this. When I switched to my P2P foundation engagement, and because I lived in Thailand, I couldn't wine and dine with funders and stuff. And basically, I wasn't making any money for 7 years. And this is very stressful for people who do transition. You kind of, your consciousness narrows down, because you're always thinking, okay, how am I going to feed my family next month? How am I going to pay for the school of my children? Because you don't want the family to suffer from your choices. So creating this kind of mechanism, right, which for me is not a handout. For me, basic income is actually recognizing contribution. we recognize that every citizen contributes to our society, and because of that, we give you support because you're a citizen, an inhabitant of our society.
Okay,
I
thank
don't
you.
think it will solve everything, but it's an important tool that we would have.
There's a question of Bernard van der Kar. In hoeverre houdt regelgeving de peer-to-peer economy tegen? So in which way does current legislation stops the transition towards a peer-to-peer economy?
A lot. I'll quote a woman from San Francisco. I'm trying to, Chanel Orsi, that's her name, from the Sustainable Economics Law Center. Because the US is even worse than Europe, but let me just tell you what she told me a few years ago. She said, you know, Michel, that it's forbidden to dry your clothes in the sun. Do you know it's forbidden to have vegetables in your garden in front of your house? Do you know it's forbidden to collect rainwater? And she gave me a list of about a dozen things that are illegal in the US. So the legislation from the French Revolution and afterwards is created on the basis of public and private. And so the commons is legally either inexistent or a small footnote in the civil code and the constitutions of our Western countries. So Napoleon basically abolished the commons as an idea. And the same happened, certainly happened in the US. And when I did my study in Ghent, for example, on housing, you have in Ghent, you had Community Land Trust, CLT Ghent. You have co-housing, is about 50 projects, maybe more now. And you have Woonkoop, the housing co-op. And they gave me a 7-page memorandum of legal obstacles to do what they want to do. So yes, so you're completely right. The regulation. So here's the logic, according to me. If you privilege the market, where everybody's working for their own interest, then you will have a legal system that is based on distrust. And so you are going to build an enormously big regulatory apparatus to contain the bad things that could happen when people do not take into account the public good. And so when you deal with the commons, that doesn't work. Because when you approach it as a commons, you have a totally different engagement in psychology. And I'd like to give you an example, which I really liked in Ghent. So you have this commons park called Drie Masters Park, geloof ik dat het noemt. Which is a real commons park taken, managed by the neighborhood, and it's fantastic. And they have 2 pigs. I think one was called Lisa. And I like to tell this story because I'm sure most of you know the difference between capitalist pigs and commons pigs. Capitalist pigs are very stressed. So they have corked tails. It's a stress phenomenon. Commons pigs, like in Ghent, have long tails like dogs that go like this when they're happy. Anyway, so here is how the city saw the issue. Oh my God, now they're enthusiastic about their pigs, but two months from now they're gonna starve, right? So this is seen like a state, seen from this point of view of distrust. So we had to make a commons accord and sign a paper where the commoners, promised to take care of the pigs before it was allowed. But this is a typical example where you see the commons logic is kind of not fitting in. And this is why we need legal and institutional changes. And this is what I call public commons protocols, right? Organizing the cooperation between the public authorities and the civic initiatives, and make it smooth and legitimate to do this instead of difficult.
Okay, there is perhaps because you referred also to the US and also everything which is legislation, there is a question of Joris. Isn't there a risk that if you introduce a basic universal income, for example, like the States perhaps wants to do it in some way, that it will actually increase even consumption? That it will be used or abused by a neoliberal system and incorporated in it? That's, I think, Joris' question.
Yes, I think certainly theoretically, you know, this can exist as a danger. Now, I have to say that wherever this was tried, it didn't show up. In other words, when you actually do a basic income and then you study the results, this is not amongst the you know, facts that come out of this experience. And I would also urge for people not to see the basic income as sufficient. Yeah. So you know what they say in English, necessary but not sufficient. So it'd be great to have it, but it's in no way, basic income alone is in no way enough to think about the transition. It's just one of the facilitating mechanisms. And we could have others. So for example, Christian Amtsberger, who is a Belgian German economist, which I really like, he talks about the transition income, which is a bit different, where you would say that 10 or 20% of the population in the city would be paid to do actual transition work. So this would not be an unconditional basic income. This would be a conditional support income for people who want to engage in the transition. It's a possibility. I'd like to give you another example, actually, which I really find very important. So what we now have is competitive procurement for everything. So if you want to do anything and you want to get subsidies, you have to compete, make the best possible project, which usually means hiding the complexity, expelling the externality, so that you're very good at one thing. We could do this entirely differently, and I give you an example. What if we would have a public accounting system that says every citizen in Antwerp can collaborate to the decarbonization of our city? Not competitive, just everybody can do it. So that you register your activities. For example, if you're a farmer and you produce a biochar, we know that so many kilos of biochar means so much less carbon, right? So you go to this institution, you get verified, and you get a token. And that token can then be financed either by the government, which says decarbonization is a social priority, so we fund it through taxation, but it can also be funded by all the institutions and corporations which profit from these activities of the citizens. So to give you one example, Terre des Liens is a community land trust in France, fairly big one. They have 75 million euro in capital. They've already calculated 5 years ago they were saving the state 300 million euro per year in water depollution costs. We have no mechanism in society today to directly fund generative work. And this is something we have to solve structurally, right? We cannot be dependent on either taxation or philanthropy. We have to invent mechanisms where if you do something good, like you improve the soil, this can be rewarded by society. And right now it isn't. Right now it's the opposite. If you're a farmer destroying your soil, you'll get a lot more subsidies than a biofarmer. If fossil fuels get 100 times more subsidies than renewable energy. And industrial agriculture get 100 times more subsidies than organic agriculture. This is not right. In this kind of transition, this is lethal for the planet.
You've been talking now a lot also about the role of the government and also the role of the citizens. There is a question from Nathan about companies. How do you see companies fitting into what you're explaining?
Yes. Okay, so my idea is to change the logic from the outside in as much as from the inside out. And from the outside in, I want to give the example of a movement that I'm a member of and that I believe in what they're doing. So this is the economy of the common good. And you might be familiar with it. So Christian Felber, he looked at all the European constitutions and saw that there's not a single constitution that says the economy should serve private shareholders. Every European constitution says the economy should serve the common good. Step one. Step two, he says the common good is not metaphysical. It's something that we can democratically decide. So you create citizen assemblies, and you start, building a consensus of what is the common good. And so they've done that. And so they have 17 clusters of impact. Now imagine this, that every corporation would be taxed and subsidized on the basis of their positive impact socially, ecologically, etc. You'd still have the companies, right? They'd still have the same structure, but in order to survive, they would have to demonstrate that they're producing good impacts. Not as a thing that they do on the side like CSR. No, this would be the core way in which they would be judged. And my thesis is, if you would do that as a society, they would have to change internally, because a predatory CEO, would not be the person that would be able to do this. You'd have to have different governance mechanisms for different kind of people to be able to lead these organizations. So that's an example, I think, of what we could do as a society to fundamentally change the whole incentive system of what is rewarded and what is punished, what is made easy and what is made difficult, right? So I used to say we walk with our heads on the street and our legs up, because what we do is we think natural resources are infinite, and it's not. And we think knowledge resources should be restricted while they are infinite. So basically we have to completely change that logic into its opposite. This is the task we have. And I always insist that social revolutions are value revolutions, right? You have the Roman Empire, it's based on slaves. The Christian medieval feudal system is ora et labora, so work has become positive. It's a complete value change. Now we reward extractive behavior. The value revolution will have to reward contributive behavior. It's complete change. And that means it's not easy, because it's it touches every human institution and every reward system and everything.
Okay, thank you. I would like to go back to Xenia because she prepared some general questions for you too. And in the meantime, if there are questions from the audience, please, I try to follow in the group chat. Xenia? Yeah,
I had some questions, but at the moment I feel like we are going with the flow and everybody just asks his own question and it's perfect. What I maybe would like to ask Michel, could you give us some inspiring examples of how P2P or the commons have changed a sector or a place or a region? Why it's P2P or the commons have helped to change this paradigm?
Yes. So one example that I like to tell is it's from Brazil, and I've been there 2 or 3 times in Rio de Janeiro, and so this is called Curto Café. It's a very old example, but I went back last year and I saw how much it had grown. So basically, Curto Café was 2 people who came from the coffee industry, and their consultation was, how is it that the people who actually make the coffee are dirt poor and are not making any progress and are literally almost starving whenever there is a crisis in the coffee sector? So he turned it around and he said, okay, can we create a way of producing coffee that doesn't do that. So first of all, that makes good coffee, because in Brazil, they had 4 categories of coffee, A, B, C, D, and A and B are exported. So even though they make very good coffee, they, their own coffee that they drink over there is not a good one. Okay, so make good coffee without exploiting people. And then they started reimagining everything around the peer-to-peer principle. So what does that mean? So it's okay, we don't want to be dependent even on fair trade, because that's usually managed by Western organizations. And we're still dependent on Western power. So instead, we'll do, originally they called it feral trade, but basically it's a fully open and transparent supply chain. That means that everybody can verify everything. So where does the coffee come from whom, how much they pay, everything is just out there, the open accounting. That was step number 1. Step number 2 was to make a coffee roaster a distributed roasting machine. So instead of roasting centrally, the farmers themselves could roast the coffee. This quadrupled their income just by doing that, placing the machines at the local level. Then third thing is they have a coffee commons, a knowledge commons about coffee. So they share their recipes, they share the blends, they share everything. So they have a community of coffee lovers. Number 4, when they wanted to have stores, they do crowd-funded retail expansion. So they basically just ask their coffee lover community, do you want to invest in the rent of a coffee shop? And your interest is free coffee. So basically these people are prepaying their coffee consumption for the future. It's a very interesting model. Then, so they do this, and they, at the first time I was there, they had a little store. And so the pricing is free pricing. So they have a poster that says, okay, we pay so much for the farmers, so much for transport. So that's why the coffee is 150, whatever. And then people pay as they wish. So they basically put money and they get a jeton, like a token. And then they did one more thing, which is they hacked the Nespresso machine so that you don't have to buy the expensive. But you see, why is this so interesting? But this is a model that has nothing to do with companies. There is no company. It's an ecosystem. It's a complex ecosystem with people coming in and out, doing their thing, and everybody is fairly rewarded. And the miracle of it is that when I came back last year, so that was like after 3 or 4 years of not meeting with them, they now have 2 or 3 huge hangars. I don't know how to say this in English, but like huge factory space. And they're trying it out with cheese. They're trying it out with chocolate. So this, I think, is a good example of how you can completely rethink the way you do business based on free networking and transparency and peer-to-peer technology, but also all these ethical principles which are embedded in this way of thinking. So this is a good example.
There's a question out of the audience regarding, okay, what you're explaining now within the current political system with voting every 4 years and perhaps not that much interested in P2P, and also perhaps even the public not too much interested in this either. How can you introduce it? How can you introduce this new logic in this political system of today?
Yes.
Good question.
So I think the issue is actually less, more an issue of awareness than issue of doing, because all the figures show that people are doing more and more commoning. So whether you calculate open source code or you calculate the number of urban commons, as I did in Ghent. So this is the same in all of Europe. This is happening all over Europe. So of course there are minorities, but once you have 2 or 3% of a population, this is already enough to induce change. But a lot of people do it without really realizing it in a form of political consciousness. And I think this is a mistake, right? So for example, think about the working class. So the farmers were chased away from the farms in the 16th century. Starting in the 16th century, they arrived in the cities where they lived until they were like 32 years on average, and then they died. Half of their kids died. The way the working class came out of this is by realizing they were working class, right? So there's a book about this from E.P. Thompson, the history of, forgot now the title, but anyway. So it's the consciousness of being in a similar situation that created the idea that they could, manage their own situation and improve it and all of that. So I think we need to do the same. For me, it's not, so people are commenting, that's not the issue, but people are commenting and they're not realizing that they're commenting, and they don't necessarily make conclusions out of it. So that's why I think that also ideas about commenting are important, because they help people become more self-conscious. And so let me give you one example. So this is the Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons. 5-6 years ago. So there was a change in the Italian constitution. They put subsidiarity in the Italian constitution. It was called the Rodotà Commission. And so then Bologna said, oh, we can use that to do something innovative in our city. And so they created this regulatory mechanism, which I call a public commons cooperation protocol, that allows any collective in Bologna to say, I'm gonna, I want to take care of a resource and see it as a commons. The first year they had 30, the second year they had 100, the third year they had 300 projects. Now 250 Italian cities are doing this, and they have 1 million people who are doing urban commoning in a legitimate and supported way. And they created this quintuple helix governance mechanism, which is the city, the business sector, the NGO sector, the research sector, and the four of them help the citizen collectives, the common-centric citizen collectives. And so they make a commons accord, and then they decide how to support the project. For me, this is a good example. And think about the Corona crisis, where we have all these maker communities mobilizing to make masks and ventilators, but there is no easy mechanism to integrate them in the hospitals. This is a regulatory legal issue. So I think we need commons politics, right? We need to think, how do we do this? How do we change the laws? How do we, and in this sense, I believe in the state, because I think every social advance, whether it's women's equality, civil rights, social welfare, has always also been a legal reform. So in the end, it's not enough just to do things on your own. You have to change the rules of the society in which you participate.
Because one of the questions of Bernard is, maybe PDP will actually replace institutions in the long term, but you're saying it's not going to replace them, but they might be different. Or...
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I think we need institutions, and especially we need public good institutions. So I'll give you the example of Bologna. So let's assume you have this rule, this regulation. Now what happens is that maybe some neighborhoods, just a moment, too much sun here. So imagine you have a neighborhood which middle-class people, and they have some extra time, right? They're going to mobilize around this new regulation. Maybe in another neighborhood with poor people who need 2 jobs to survive. Maybe they don't have the time, right? So what I'm saying is that without rights that are for every citizen, and which are protected by a separate institution, even commons are unequal. Like if you're in a commons, you care for your own commons, you don't care for other commons. And you know, the good example is the Middle Ages, right? The Middle Ages were a completely decentralized system, and yet it was very hierarchical. And that's what you see with the Bitcoin communities, right? They want to be very decentralized, but the division of wealth in Bitcoin communities is more unequal than in society. So there is no automatic idea that you can have a decentralized system and a more equal society. It doesn't work, because what matters is the competition for the scarce resources. Any competition for scarce resource creates oligarchy, because in an interactive game, every round there's already somebody stronger than you, and they start accumulating. So that's why we need redistribution mechanisms. And who can enforce that, right? So think about social welfare. When the working class was organizing their own fraternal organizations, only 20% of the population benefited from it. When it was generalized after World War II, 100% of the citizens had access to social welfare. This is why we need a society, and not just people making agreements amongst each other, because that gives you feudalism. Like, so I'm going to make an agreement with you, Xenia, because you're very powerful and you can protect me. Yeah. So we decentralized, and I freely give you my fealty because I need protection, because there is no protective mechanism in society except strong people. This is why we need common good institution. That's my point of view.
There's a very general question, but maybe an interesting one. How do we scale up or scale out whole system design, including governance, for commons interests at, say, bi-regional scale?
Yes. So I'll give you an example.
Question from Neil.
So I was saying in the beginning that we need to mutualize our provisioning systems, right? We need to have a lot more sharing of resources, like shared transportation, etc., etc. So imagine you do this in Barcelona, and you create Airbnb instead of Airbnb, because Airbnb has enormously negative effects on cities. Why would you then in Antwerp start from zero, right? And that's what's happening right now. So I went to Tuscany. They had 13 pieces of software for collective purchasing of organic food. What a waste of effort. So a protocol, and I call this a protocol cooperative. So why don't cities get together and say, we will make shared protocols for housing, for transportation, and this is how you scale, right? This is why you have permaculture. It looks small when you see in your own city, maybe you have a dozen projects, but on the global scale, it's scaled. It's scaled because the protocol was being, you know, copied and shared everywhere. And so I believe in this is one of the ways you can scale peer-to-peer, not by creating centralized hierarchies, but by creating these shared protocols that everybody can apply, adapt to their local situation, and create organizations around it that support that particular commons. And so what I want you to imagine is this. Now we have territorial organizations, states, and they cannot solve a whole issue, a whole set of problems. Then we have corporations, and they are virtual resource-based entities, right? So you have a tension in our world between nation states, which are territorial, and the big companies, even though they're linked more or less to nation states, they have much bigger ambitions, and they send their money around the world. They don't pay taxes. And what we don't have, and this is what we need to build, we need to build global regenerative associations. So you have the open source community, you have the generative entrepreneurial, or I call them entrepreneurial coalitions around them. And then we have the non-profits that manage the cooperative commons, that manage the infrastructure of cooperation. And we need to be able to scale this at a global level. Otherwise, we don't have a balance, right? The reason we cannot change our societies right now is because the nation state, which is capital, state, and nation, what you used to have, this is what Polanyi talks about. So every 30 years or so, you would have the nation mobilizing and forcing the state to re-embed the market in society. He calls it the lib-lab pendulum. So 30 years of markets freeing themselves from society, and 30 years of markets being re-embedded in society. And this is, in capitalism, this is like a pendulum. And it's no longer working. It's no longer working because the state is still national, but capital is now transnational. So any state that wants to change something is immediately sabotaged. Look at what happened in Greece. You know, they closed the banks, people can get their money. So you're bankrupt within 3 days. So we cannot just change anymore at the nation state level. We have to build organizations that can compete with transnational capital.
There are like two interesting remarks made. One from Nathan: scaling out through the cosmolocal approach, it all comes together. I think that's right. So using your cosmolocal approach can also help to scale out. And then there is somebody comparing it to a virus. Eve is saying that kinds of scaling is how a virus works. Put DNA into put DNA in the DNA of another host. So maybe we can use the Corona idea. I don't know what.
It's a good example because that's what it is. So a protocol, you know, is just a set of instructions like a virus that can replicate. And of course, my work is on the idea level, is to create concepts that can travel around the world and that can inspire people, right? It's the same idea, is that you create concepts that are exportable and that can inspire people in their how they think about change.
If I gave you a magic wand right now and you could change the world, you know, do everything, no problems with regulations, with people not listening, and so on, how would the world look like in your ideal imagination?
Okay, maybe two things. A positive one and a negative one. The positive one is actually the basic income, because I think if you give every person in the world access to food, shelter, you know, like really the basics, that opens up so much human potential. All these people which are now stressing out, fearful of the future, and maybe thinking that they should take it from somebody else, right? Otherwise they won't make it. So I think this is one thing that I think would be really useful. And the second thing is a bit more negative and maybe a bit more difficult to explain, but it's the idea of internalizing nature, right? So my argument is the following. After World War III, we created a social contract between capital and labor, but at the cost of nature and the global south. So we created a welfare system, but it didn't take into account natural limits and exploitation of resources in the global south. And if you actually look at the Anthropocene, it started in the 50s, right? I mean, there's a discussion of when it started, but basically what they call the hockey stick, when basically we really started overusing nature since the 1950s. And that's a paradox, right? So we pacify the Western working class at the cost of a hyper exploitation of nature. And so the next step is to create a social compact between humanity and the living world. We need a contract with the bees and the earthworms and every codependency in the world. And so this is going to be less sexy as a solution, but I wrote this report last year, and what I'm imagining is a global infrastructure of coordinated production. The first layer is mutual coordination, shared accounting, shared logistics. The second layer is generative markets, so designing market tools that are, I'll give you an example. Fishcoin is a coin that knows how many fish can be fished. Our money doesn't tell us that now, right? We don't know. If you have a fish coin, then you know this is the fish we can take out of the sea without destroying the self-reproduction of the fish. So all kinds of solutions. And the third level, and this is what I say why it's negative, is integrate planetary boundaries in all levels of decision making. So imagine you'd have like the American Chemical Society, which has a very nice table, a Mendeleev table. It has all the resources that are available. And you have a global thresholds and allocations council, like the World Health Organization, that says, okay, this is the resource base that we have in the world. We cannot grow more than 1% in material usage because otherwise it's exponential. And this is equitable, you know, for the whole world. And then you bring it down to the continental, regional, bioregional, city level. And that would mean that all of humanity would know what the limits are of our freedom, right? The limits of our freedom is when we destroy others. And so this is, I think, so we need some kind of strong multilateral, not a world government, but some strong multilateral organizations that can protect planetary boundaries.
Okay, thank you very much, Michel. You have another question, Eddie?
Yeah, in the meantime, I checked Eric Boyden's question. So he's talking about the fact that there are a lot of elderly people that are retired, that have money, that are still physically very healthy. Can they be incorporated in order to promote this idea one way or another?
Yes, so in my wiki, which is wiki.p2pfoundation.net, I organize it per domain, right? So you have housing, transportation, care. So it's not something I follow closely because I think I'm still young. But definitely it's happening everywhere. So I have DGO tags like P2P aging, which I could send to you. So yes, there are things happening in elder care. And for example, old people are mutualizing their housing. This is very popular in Nordic and Anglo-Saxon countries where instead of going to a home where you lose all your rights, you basically create a collective. And then you hire a nurse for everyone. But you are in charge, right? Just an anecdote, this is how education started. In Bologna in the 12th century, the students organized the university, chose their teachers, and managed the university.
Yes.
So originally our European universities were peer-to-peer universities.
I think we'll close with a question of Nathan, which is, what would your advice be for the leaders of tomorrow? So mayors of cities, CEOs, founders of startups, and so on.
Yeah, you know Ikigai, right? I'm a big fan of Ikigai. So first, find your passion, find what gives you energy. Find your skills, because having a passion without skills, yeah, that's not a good thing. Find out how you can make a living, and find out how you can use this for the good of the world, right? So if you have those 4 questions, you have your answer. basically, I think so. And I think that's what peer-to-peer is about. It's about creating a global system of where everybody can say, oh, I want to do this. And then you join a collective project and you contribute and you create an economy around it. That's ideally what we're talking about. That you really start from yourself. So I consider myself an ouvrier, as they say in French. Not un ouvrier, but un ouvrier, right? At some point in your life, hopefully, you can find what is it? Why are you here? I don't think it's written in the stars personally, but you can find it. And the reason you find it is because it makes you happy. You know.
If you connect with your heart and what you just heard Michel telling us, what do you feel you don't need any longer in your own life or in society right now? So what is it you would like to let go? Wat willen wij loslaten? En gewoon opschrijven in de chat.
Eigendom, ego, fear, stress, angst, kapitalisme, fear, wantrouwen, regels, waiting, roestigheid van gewoontedieren, wanhoop. Let go of yourself to discover yourself. A lot of things that I possess. Non-transparency. De zekerheid alles al te weten dat relevant is. En dan weer openheid creëren. Saaiheid. Private property. Fear and ego culture. Minder egoïsme ten voordele van een gedeeld eigenbelang. Toestemming. Single living. Chaos, leegzuigen, onrust, regeltjes volgen. Certainty. Property. Gebrek aan zelfvertrouwen. Singularity. Rekenschap geven oké, maar geen waanzinnige controle. Education forming selfish choices. Curricula. Gebrek aan wetenschappelijk inzicht en kritisch denken.
Schud alles uit, al de energie nu. En de volgende vraag is: what are you longing for? What is your biggest desire? What does your heart say? Yes, this is what I would like more of. En even goed nu in de chat.
Love, harmony and beauty. Innerlijke en uitwendige vrede. Deep connection. Een haalbaar dealmodel ontwikkelen. Fairness. Living with the animals in nature. Empathy. Justice. Interact with many people and cultures. Honesty. Deugddoende ontmoeting. Weten en leven dat alles één is. Autonome vrijheid met een harmonisch collectief. Garden of dreams. Connection with nature. Loving and distributive responsibility. Een overheid die mee is in dit verhaal. To find my essential piece of contribution. Harmony and peace. Wildness restored. Familiedomeinen van 1 hectare in sync met de natuur. Flow. Transparantie en empowerment. Deze beweging optillen tot meer gedeeld maatschappelijk debat dat leidt tot verandering. soevereiniteit, wholeness experience. Een nieuwe taal los van ideologische concepten.
Dankjewel. Dankjewel iedereen. Nu gaan we zo meteen terug in chatrooms. En de bedoeling zou zijn om je de toekomst te herinneren. So we will go into chatrooms and the question would be, imagine that you're like in 2030, so we're 10 years from now. And let's say that after Corona, there was Morona and Borona and all other kinds of viruses that came along and that actually helped us to change really everything. And you're coming back from 2030 and you share your memories with each other. We will just do that like for 10 minutes and then we'll come back and some of us will just share it in the big circle. Okay? Who wants to share?
Ik heb wat genoteerd. We waren in een wereld met sprekende dieren, kleinschalige activiteit. Het was simpel, het was stil. Er was veel meer groen, veel meer rust. Er was een Googlepedia en een Facebookpedia. Zo dus niks meer commercieel. Er waren abdijen, plekken waar mensen elkaar ontmoeten en er was tijd om dingen te doen waar mensen zin voor hadden. Meer droomtuinen, er werd samengewerkt, alles flourishte. En er waren geen... Oké, voilà, dat was het.
Ik vind vooral alles flourishte de max. Dat zouden we eens moeten gaan introduceren. Oké, Ineke.
Maar het was veel te veel om allemaal op te schrijven, maar...
Wauw. Dus heb je dat nu gedaan?
Ja.
Amai.
Super.
Ik heb eigenlijk alleen maar de belangrijkste... of wat ik gehoord heb als belangrijkste woorden opgeschreven. En de natuur is zo wat door heel de tekening gekomen.
Oké, wie wil er nog delen?
Ja, ik heb een woordspeling die mij ingegeven is van oordelen naar luisterdelen. Dat is de big shift. Van oordelen naar luisterdelen.
Ah, fantastisch.
De max.
In onze groep was het vooral ook over caring en de zorg en levenseinde. En dat geen einde mag zijn. Dat we in 2030 zijn dat rituelen waar we zowel ontvangen van het leven als uit het leven stappen. Want alles is energie. Een doodgaan als such bestaat niet. En terwijl zijn we ook bezig om voor elkaar te zorgen, zodat de energie die dat we nodig hebben om het tegengewicht te bieden aan wat dat er allemaal nog op ons afkomt de komende 10 jaar, om dat samen te kunnen dragen. Voilà, korte samenvatting.
Mooi. Bij ons in de groep bracht Hans eigenlijk iets heel moois op. Gewoon een observatie van de voorbije weken of maanden. Hoe dat de jeugd, maar ook volwassenen, op een heel andere manier aan het samenleven zijn en van elkaar aan het genieten zijn. En ik vond dat wel een mooie observatie eigenlijk, want dat is ook zo. Ik heb mij in de laatste 10 jaar afgevraagd van mijn kleinkinderen, wat doen die? Die spelen binnen 4 muren en ineens zie ik ze op straat. En dat is een omwenteling van hoe we in de laatste 10, 20 jaar hebben geleefd eigenlijk. We gaan terug naar hoe we leefden toen wij kinderen waren. En dat is...
Michel, jij moet bijna weg. Wil jij nog iets delen met ons alvorens te vertrekken?
Niet echt, maar gewoon zeggen dat ik het echt plezierig vond. Ik vind het heel tof ploeg. En heel veel dank aan Xenia en Eddy om dat zo plezant te organiseren. Dus weet je, soms voelt je zo uitgeput na zo'n sessie, maar in dit geval dus omgekeerd. Dus heel veel dank.
En jij bent hartelijk bedankt om bij ons te zijn geweest. En als je nog eens naar België komt, geef eens een seintje, dan komen we met z'n allen nog eens samen. En liefst in de droomgaard of zo, bij Erik Boydens.
Ja, we hebben natuur nodig, hè, want zo altijd binnen zitten, dat is toch niet plezant, hè?
Dat is niet, hè?
Nee.
Dus en bedankt ook voor jouw link en nog een prettige dag. Nog heel veel P2P en Commons plezier, hè?
Ja, heel veel dank aan iedereen. Dank voor de aandacht en ook voor het delen en zo. Dus, en tot de volgende keer dan. Hè.
Dag
En dag
Michel.
Niel, hè, als er nog zit, misschien niet. Ja,
Dank je, Michel. Fantastisch.
Salutjes.
Bye bye. Bye bye
Bye.
everyone.
Mooie dag wensen.